need to see God for who he is, because God is all knowing, he's all powerful, and he's all loving, and he's everywhere. So we'll start reading in verse number 1. And if you want to outline this before we begin, if you want to outline this chapter, verses 1 through 6, David talks about the fact that that he's all knowing. And then verses 7 through 12 teaches us that God is omniscient, which means that 1 through 6, that he's omniscient, all knowing. 7 through 12, he's omnipresent. And then 13 through 18, he's omnipotent, which means he's all powerful. And then 19 through 24, he's omnibenevolent. God is all loving. So let's begin reading in verse number 1. We'll go through verse number 6, and we'll look at the fact that God is omniscient. The psalmist says, "O Lord, thou hast searched me and known me. Thou knowest my down sitting and my uprising. Thou understandest my thought afar off. Thou compassest my path and my lying down, and art acquainted with all my ways. For there is not a word in my tongue, but lo, O Lord, thou knowest it altogether. Thou hast beset me behind and before, and laid thine hand upon me." And so remember when I said before that when we look at the nature of God, we need to look at it also in the context of who we are in his presence. And so that is what David is saying in 139. He's saying that God is omniscient, that he's all knowing. And so in verse number 4, he says, and we see how he explains it. He says in verse number 1, he says, "O Lord, thou hast searched me and you have known me." And so the overall theme of this passage is that God knows everything about everything. And he knows everything about me. He knows everything about you. And when we say he knows everything about us. Verse 1, he says, "You have searched me." Now, the Hebrews writer says in Hebrews 4 that everything is open before the eyes of God, of whom we have to do. In other words, God knows everything about us. Verse 2, he says, "Thou knowest my what? My down sitting and my uprising. Thou understandest my thought afar off." And so David says, you know everything about me, Lord. You know my down sitting, when I sit down. You know when I rise up. And then he says, you understand my thoughts afar off. Isn't that amazing? You know my thoughts afar off. You know what I am going to think and what I'm going to do before I do it. And so when you think about a being that is that powerful, that knows everything about you, he not only knows what we do, but he knows our thoughts. Our thoughts, what we think. And you think about how powerful that is. The only way when I speak to you and when you speak to me, right, what are we doing? We're conversing. We're speaking to one another. And why do we speak to one another? Why do we communicate? What makes us different from the animals? The fact that we communicate with words. And what is a word? It's just a vehicle that does what? That carries an idea. In other words, you can't know what I'm thinking unless I tell you what I'm thinking. Now, my wife thinks that she can read my mind sometimes. And most of the times she is probably right? Sometimes she's off a little bit. Sometimes I have to correct her a little bit and say, well, look, this is what I'm thinking. Let me tell you. So the point is that we can't know what we're thinking unless we say it to one another. But God knows what we're thinking even before we think it. He knows our thoughts are far off. And so, again, under that theme, the psalmist says that, God, you know everything about me. He says, you compasseth my path and my lying down. You are acquainted with all my ways. Now, he says, you know where I'm going. That's what he means when he says, you compass my path and my lying down. You are acquainted with all my ways. God knows where I'm going, where I have been in the past, and where I am now. Now, when we think about this, we can think about this, I guess, in a negative aspect, but also in a positive aspect. Isn't it wonderful to know that we serve a God that knows everything about us? Because John 12 says that when we stand before him, he's going to be our what? He's going to be our judge. So the fact that he knows what I'm thinking, he knows what I'm going to think before I think. He knows everything about me. He is a righteous judge. He is just because he knows everything. Now that's comforting to me because it knows that he is the only true and right judge. And we know that when we stand before God, he's going to judge us righteously because he knows everything. He knows everything about us. Verse 4, for there is not a word in my tongue, but lo, O Lord, thou knowest it altogether. And so God knows what we speak. He not only knows what we speak, he knows what we mean when we speak. He knows our words altogether. Verse 5, he said, you have beset me behind and before. You have laid your hand upon me. And so what does the psalmist saying in verse number 5? You have beset me behind and before, and you have laid your hand upon me. Lord, you are all around me. You are all around me. You know everything about me. And so when we look at verses 1 through 5, when we look at the fact that God is all-knowing, most times we think in terms of the creation, that God knows, as Isaiah said, he knows every star in the universe. There are billions of galaxies, and each galaxy has billions of stars, and God has named all of them. He knows the names of all of them. He knows the very hairs that are upon our head. God knows the beginning from the end, right? These are all things about God that teach us that he's what? All-knowing. He knows everything. But David makes it personal, does he not? He makes it personal. David says, God knows everything about me. He knows everything about you. He knows, verse 1, everything. He knows your thoughts. He knows where you're going, where you've been. He knows your words. He knows he's all around you. He knows everywhere he knows everything about us. And so he makes it personal, which also goes along with the fact when Jesus said, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, whosoever believes in him should not perish or have everlasting. Jesus came to die for the world, didn't he? Is that true? But guess what? He came and he died for me, and he died for you. It's personal. Now, look at any questions or comments? Now, verse 6 finishes it off. He says, such knowledge is what? Too wonderful for me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high. I cannot attain to it. Now, as we went through those verses, the power is in God's word. I may not have the ability to explain it or put it in such a way, but when you consider what the psalmist says, that fact that he knows everything about you, he knows your thoughts before you think them. Now, what effect does that have upon your mind? Now, the psalmist David says, when I think about that, when I think about the fact that God knows everything about me, he knows what I think before I think it, he knows my words, he knows my path, he knows all of my ways. He says, such knowledge is too wonderful for me. I can't begin to contemplate, like, what, that's just too wonderful. It's too wonderful for me when I think about that God knows everything about me. And you know what it does to me? And I hope it does for you. Isn't that humbling? That's humbling to know that God knows everything about me. That puts me, I don't know about you, but that puts me in my place. Greg.
Well, also along with that, we sometimes look at people, maybe judge in ways we shouldn't judge.
Yeah.
But God will judge us. He knows us, he knows our heart. Mm-hmm. So that's comforting.
Right. So the comment was made that sometimes we judge people and we don't know everything about them, but God knows everything about us. And it's comforting to know that he's going to judge us. Any other comments, questions? All right, let's look at verses 7 through 11. God is omnipresent. God is everywhere. He's everywhere, omnipresent. That's what it means. Verse 7, whither shall I go from thy spirit, or whither shall I flee from thy presence? If I ascend up into heaven, thou art there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, thou art there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, he says, even there shall thy hand lead me, and thy right hand shall hold me up. If I say, surely that the darkness shall cover me, even the night shall light me about. Yea, the darkness hides not from thee, but the night shines as the day. The darkness and the light are both alike to thee. In other words, we cannot run from God. He is everywhere. Not only is he all-knowing, he's omnipresent. David says, whither shall I go from thy spirit? Or whither shall I flee from thy presence? Sister Dixie.
We might forget to pray, or we might have a moment that we don't believe God. But it's comforting to me to know just to leave little old me. He's lovely and he's got his eyes on me.
Mm-hmm.
He's caring for me. He sees me in the past that is coming up.
Right. So Sister Dixie was saying that it's comforting to know that God's eyes are over us, right? Because the fact that he's omnipresent means that he sees what? That he sees everything. He sees everything. And so we can look at one aspect of it. A lot of people, we should fear God. But then the other aspect of it is that it should be comforting to us that God sees everything. He sees everything. We talk about, things that are happening in our world today. And sometimes it seems as if evil has the upper hand. God sees everything. He knows.
And the positive part about it, he sees everything. He knows everything in advance. He's saving us from a lot. Give an example. We're on the highway and somebody comes, almost comes in our lane and hurts us. Well, God is saving us there.
Right.
He's protecting us.
Right.
So, he knew that was going to happen.
Right.
He planned everything on how he was going to protect us.
Right. So she was saying that.
One example, I had a big about this
Mm-hmm.
that came across me on 16. Through the tire, came straight across. And the person saved me this time.
So she was saying that, it's comforting to know that God is everywhere, right? And then another point about that is, as we're talking about this, when we think about, you use the word attributes, but we can use the word nature of God, that he's holy in all of his attributes or nature. Because God can be all-knowing, but if he wasn't omnipresent, how can he know everything? Because he can't see everything, right? So he's holy in all of his attributes. And so David says, whither shall I go from thy spirit? Or whither shall I flee from thy presence? And the answer, of course, to that is nowhere, because God is there. He says, if I ascend up into heaven, thou art there. If I make my bed in hell, thou art there. And so now that word hell that is used in this context, he's talking about the unseen abode of the dead. When we read of the rich man and Lazarus, you remember the rich man lifted his eyes in torment, and then Lazarus was in Abraham's bosom. He says that even God is there. We may ask the question, well, how can God be where those are that are being tormented? Well, when we think about the presence of God, the Bible talks of the presence of God in different senses, right? Where God promised his disciples that he will be with us even until the end of the world. Well, how is God's presence with us? Through his word, right? He's with us providentially. Remember when Paul talked about, he says, well, for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. In other words, if I stay here, I get to encourage you, but if I die, I get to go be with God. So the fact that he wasn't in heaven with God, but he says, if I'm here, that I'm away from God, but God's presence is still with us. And so when it talks about God's presence being, in Hades, you got to think about the terms of fact that whatever God has decreed, his power is present everywhere. So David says, if I ascend to the heavens, it doesn't matter where you go in the universe, God is there. Why? Because he decreed it. His power, the manifestation of his power is there. And so David says in verse 9, if I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea. When I read this verse, I don't know if you all watched have you ever seen that show, Drain the Oceans? Any of you ever watched that, Drain the Oceans? It comes on the History Channel. And so what they do is they have the technology where they can, quote, drain the oceans, and they can remove all the water, and they can look at the ocean seafloor and all the, the different things that are there, like battleships and mountain terrains in the ocean, as if there was no water there. And so I was watching this one episode, and they drained the oceans and a part of the sea. And scientists discovered that there are mountain ranges in the oceans that make the Grand Canyon look like little pea hills. Can you imagine that? Mountain ranges in the oceans that make the mountains that we see look like little molehills. To me, that is astounding. And so David, when I thought about that, David says, if I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, he says, even there your hand lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. And that lets us know David is saying, he makes it personal, that God's presence is not only in the universe and everywhere. That reminds David that your presence is there to lead me and to guide me. Verse 11, if I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, even the night shall be light around me. Yea, the darkness hides not from thee, but the night shines as the day. The darkness and the light are both alike unto thee. Now, when we think about complete darkness, utter darkness where there is no evidence or no flicker of light anywhere, David says the light and the darkness are the same to God. It doesn't matter. They can be as dark as it was in the beginning, right? In the beginning was the Word was with God, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. Can you imagine a darkness where there is no light, period? But God saw everything. He was there.
We can understand that if we walk in the light.
Yes, if we walk in the light, we can understand that exactly. So in other words, David is saying, you know what? The night and the day are the same to God. It doesn't matter. Verse 12, the darkness hides not from thee. The darkness can't hide anything from God. But the night shines as the day. The darkness and the light are alike to thee. And so he says that God he's omnipresent. He's everywhere. Any questions or comments on that? Now, God is all powerful. He's all powerful. Verse 13, you have possessed my reins, or my inward parts. You have covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are the works of thy hand, that my soul knoweth right well. My substance was not hid from thee when I was made in secret and curiously brought in the lowest parts of the earth. Thine eyes did see my substance, yet being unperfect, and in thy book all my members were written, which in continuance were fashioned, when there was none of them. How precious also are the thoughts unto me, O God, how great is the sum of them. If I should count them, they are more in number than the sand. When I awake, I am still with thee. And so we can see in this verse, David talks about the fact that God is omnipotent, that he is all powerful. And notice how he illustrates it. He points to the human body And he points to the formation of a child in the womb. And David says, when you see that, how God causes the child to form in the womb, he says, now that's a powerful God. He points to the human body. And I don't have to make this a science class, do it. When we talk about the wonders of the human body and what it does, David says, when you think about how God created us, in verse 14, he says, I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Fearfully and wonderfully made, he says, marvelous are your works, and that my soul knoweth right well. When you think about the human body and what it does, and all the systems and everything, how it works together, David says we're fearfully and wonderfully made. And so he uses that to illustrate that God is all powerful. Verse 13, he says, you have possessed my inward parts, my reins. You have covered me in my mother's womb. You remember Jeremiah said that God knew me even before he formed me. Verse 14, I will praise thee. In other words, David is saying God is to be praised when we look at the marvelous wonders of the human body because he's all powerful. Only God can do that. Only God can create, because only God can, when we look at create, it means to what? Make something out of nothing. So God fashioned man. He created man in his image, right? We're human. We get our DNA from our mothers and our fathers, don't we? But our spirit comes from whom? Comes from God. That's why James says the body without the spirit is what? Is dead. And so he talks about the formation of the child in the womb. And so when we talk about the child in the womb, in other words, God attributed that process of conception, the phases of gestation, or whatever you want to call it, and then being born, he attributes that to God. He says that God is responsible for that. And so he says, that's why he says in verse 15, my substance was not hid from thee when I was made in secret and curiously wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. Your eyes did see my formation. Again, here we can see, we talked about the fact that God is everywhere. He says, your eyes can see my formation. God is not only omnipresent, he's all knowing, and he's all powerful. Your eyes can see my substance, yet being unperfect. And in the book of all my members were written, which in continuance were fashioned when as yet there was none of them. Again, like you look at verse 17, and then I like to compare that with, verse number 6. When David thought about the fact that God knew everything about him, he says, such knowledge is too wonderful for me. And look at verse 17. How precious also are thy thoughts unto me, O God. How great is the sum of them. When man thinks, we're made in the image of God, we create, things in a sense, not in the sense that God creates. But when we think, when we have our thoughts, we create things like the internet and the 7 wonders of the world. But when we think about God's thoughts, we have the universe. We have the human body. We have, even on the atomic level, when you think about the atom, at the molecular level, that's like looking at a whole another universe in and of itself. And so when God think of the wonders, we get a universe, right? We get the human body. We get the wonders of childbearing and childbirth. And so David says, in verse 17, how precious are your thoughts unto me, O God, how great is the sum of them. And if I should count them, they are more in number than the sand. When I awake, I am still with thee. So again, we're talking about how powerful God is. And he illustrates that using the human body. And then David extols how great God is, right? How precious are your thoughts unto me, O God. We should take time to contemplate, right? And to meditate upon God. And as I explained before, when we talk about meditation as a Christian, right? The Eastern mystic religions of the world, they say, empty yourself. Oh, you must empty yourself and find meaning in the universe, all these different types of things. But when we meditate upon, when it comes to Christianity and God's word, we're commanded and we're encouraged to do what? To fill our minds with God's word, right? I will meditate upon your words, upon your law. And so that's what the psalmist is saying. How precious also are your thoughts unto me. When was the last time you thought about how great God is? We sang that this morning, right? There is a God. There is a God. What does that mean? Well, that's what the psalmist is telling us, right? The fact that there is a God, that's not even up for debate. And that's what Paul talked about in Romans 1. We can see from the creation that there is an intelligent, all-knowing, all-powerful being that created it. That's just evident from creation, not even considering God's word. But the fact that there is a creation teaches us that there is an all-knowing, all-powerful God. Now, when was the last time you thought about God, his nature, and what it means to you in a personal way? When you go to the beach or go into the ocean, you see that vast expanse of water. You hear the roaring waves, the crashing waves. You contemplate, think about God. When you see the sands on the shore, the billions of particles of sand, probably even more than that, do you think about how it got there? How precious are your thoughts unto me, O God. How great is the sum of them. How precious, verse 18, if I should count them, he says, they are more in number than the sand. When I awake, I am still with thee. And, and here again is another comforting thing. When we think about all-knowing, all-powerful God, do we not sense that David is saying that for the child of God, that he says he is near, God is near me, I am still with thee. He is approachable. And ultimately, we know that we can approach him because of what Christ accomplished on the cross. Now, any questions or comments? Anything else anybody wants to say? All right, verse 19. Here he talks about the fact that God is omnibenevolent. God is all loving. Can you imagine if I had that kind of power? Or if you had that kind of power, what would you do with it? If you were omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent. We see what men do with men in our world today who have great power, don't they? Of course, it's not the power that God had, but they have great power in this world. And what are they doing with it? The scientific advancements that we've done, they should be for man's good, right? And it shows that we're not God. Why? Here's another important fact, that God is all loving. Now, when we think about the fact that God is all loving, we shouldn't get the wrong impression of who God is. Because God is a God of love, but he is also a God of wrath. God loves, but if the fact that he loves means that he hates sin. If God didn't hate sin, he wouldn't be a God of love. Now, look at what the psalmist says. Surely thou wilt slay the wicked, O God. Depart from me, therefore, ye bloody men. For they speak against thee wickedly, and your enemies take thy name in vain. Do not I hate them, O Lord, that hate thee? Am I not grieved with those that rise up against thee? I hate them with perfect hatred. I count them mine enemies. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts. If there is any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. And so you say, why would this be a passage that talks about the fact that God is omnibenevolent or all loving? Because we can see what God hates, don't we? And the fact that he hates sin and that he hates evil means that he loves what? He loves righteousness. He loves that which is good. Because as John said, God is love, right? He is love. That is his essence. That is his nature. That is who he is. And I made the point before. John says that we love him because what? He first loved us. In other words, we have to learn to love, don't we? We have to learn to love. We created in the image of God, therefore we have a soul, we have a spirit, we have the capacity to learn to love, and we have to learn how to love. And so it says we love him because he loved us. In other words, what is it that motivates us to love God? Because we see his love for us. So why do we love God? We love him because he first loved us. Again, why does God love? What's the answer to that? God is love. God doesn't have to learn to love. He is love. That is his nature. And so when God loves, that means that he hates that which is darkness. He hates evil. He hates that which anything that goes against the nature of God, God hates it. And so David, how does he illustrate it? He says, surely thou wilt slay the wicked, O God. Depart from me, therefore, ye bloody men. Again, verse 19. David says that God will slay the wicked. It's not based on the person's nature, it's based on their behavior. We're not born sinners, we become sinners. We become wicked. And so David says, God will slay the wicked, O God. Depart from me, therefore, ye bloody men. For they speak against thee wickedly, and your enemies take thy name in vain. So again, he shows the behavior of wicked men. For they speak against thee wickedly, and your enemies take your name in vain. Therefore, they're deserving of wrath and punishment. You know, the only thing we deserve in this world, we live in an entitlement nation, don't we? Everybody feels like they should deserve something, or we should get this and we should get that. And we think about the goodness of God, that he causes his rain to rain on the good and the evil, the just and the unjust. That's all his goodness and his love, because really the only thing that we all deserve is what? Romans 6:23. We all deserve death. That's it. And the fact that we have, God has provided a way for us to have redemption, that's because of his love. And so David says, they speak evil against me, your enemies take your name in vain. Do not I hate them, O Lord, that hate thee? Now that's a question for us to contemplate. Do not I hate them, O Lord, that hate thee? In other words, are we striving to be more like God? You remember that catalog of sins in Romans 1 where he talks about, let me just turn there quickly. Romans 1, and when David gives that list, the catalog of sins, and where he talks about, let's see, verse 29, the covetous, the malicious, those that are full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, despiteful, proud, boastful, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, implacable, unmerciful. Notice he says, who knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of what? Worthy of death. In other words, you get what you deserve when you practice these things. But then notice he said, not only those who commit such things, but those that have pleasure in them that do them. You might say, well, I don't practice these things. Well, do you approve of those who practice these things? David asked the question, do I hate them, O Lord, that hate thee? Do I hate what God hates? God hates sin. Do I hate sin in all of its forms? Because if I don't hate sin, I can't say that I love God, because God hates sin. And then he says in verse, the other part, he says, and am I not agreed with those that rise up against thee? Verse 22, I hate them with perfect hatred. I count them mine enemies. And so we're talking about God hates sin, but does that mean that God hates individuals? Does God hate people? No, he doesn't. He hates the sin that we commit. There wouldn't be verses like, for God so loved the world, John 3:16, or Romans 5:8, for God he commended his love toward us while we were yet sinners. So no one can say that God hates mankind, but God couldn't be God if he didn't hate sin, because he's a holy God, and God cannot approve of sin. He cannot be in the presence of sin. Therefore, he hates sin. And so he says, I hate them with perfect hatred. I count them mine enemies. James talks about being enemies with God, or John 8. Search me, O God. Here again, search me, O God, and know my heart. Now, who is David asking to search him? The God who knows what? Everything, the God who is everywhere, the God who has all power. Now, does he have the ability to search you? Well, sure he does.
He's going to judge our heart.
Exactly. He's going to judge our heart.
So we better have it right. We better be happy to circumstance that we are telling one.
Right. Exactly. Does that make you fearful? That should be comforting to know, right? That he knows everything about you. Therefore, when he judges you, it will be righteous judgment. And so that's his plea. Search me, O God, and know my heart, and try me and know my thoughts. If there be any wicked way in me, if there's anything wicked in me, he says, lead me in the way, what? Everlasting.
I'm thankful that he judges me correctly, because mankind doesn't.
Right. Right. And we're to judge righteous judgment, but we're not God. And so when we stand before God, now look at verse 24. And see if there be any wicked way in me. In other words, here's a man that wants to be pleasing with God. He wants God to be pleased with him. If there's any wicked way in me, have you thought about that? God, I want you to search me. Lord, look at me. I want you to look at every part of me, my thoughts, my ways, when I lie down, when I get up. I want you to search me. If there is any wicked way in me, Lord, I want you to show me, and I want you to lead me in the way everlasting. Here is a man, David, that contemplates and sees the power of God, the love of God, and he says, look, where you are, Lord, he said, you're qualified. You are the only one that's qualified to search me and to lead me in the way everlasting. Any questions or comments? Okay. I think we're going to switch gears a little bit next Sunday. April, let's see, next Sunday, we'll stay in the Psalms. But instead of Psalms of praise, we're going to switch gears. We may look at some of the penitent Psalms or some of the historical Psalms. I don't know which ones yet, but we're going to look at some of those. So again, I encourage you to go back and read Psalm 139. And really, as David says, he says, when I think of who you are, your thoughts, they are great and precious to me. So I appreciate your comments and your attention.